Hi, I'm Mary Lyons, the Wealth Woman.
And I'm Eric Alexander with Acorn Grove.
Welcome to the Wealth and Income Podcast. I am feeling very vindicated, validated, excited about our topic today. I know we always say excited, but I think the first ones here are key because one of our listeners sent in a link to a podcast that actually I think they were listening to this morning as we are recording this. It's Monday. And it is, part of it dovetails really, really nicely with what we talk about. So Eric, you want to give maybe a little of the background on, is it an article or a podcast? I was looking at the transcript, so I said article, but.
Yeah, no, it was a podcast and it was from, I think, the New York Times. I can't remember. The Daily, I think is what it's called. Yeah. And I've never listened to their podcast. But the opening line or the title of the podcast is, was the 401k a mistake? And so it was an intriguing, and I actually haven't listened to it. I've only been sort of pouring through the transcript, but trying to understand, okay, how are they approaching this? Where are they going with this? What's their take? Like how do they look at it? And to your point, it's fairly vindicating that it falls in line with a lot of the things that we've been saying the past few years of, hey, this thing sounds like a great deal, but it has some gotchas in it. And if you don't understand the gotchas, then you're one of the gotchas. Like you're going to get it. It may not be the greatest thing that you think it is.
Yeah, I think so kind of consistently, I think we've been saying on the podcast that if you retired if you started working in 1978, you would just now be retiring today.
Right.
And there's a line in the podcast that I was like, oh my gosh, there it is. There's a piece of me that was like, have these people been listening to us? And they just wrote an article based off of what we've been saying. And then they take a different turn.
I was about to say, I don't think they have, because they took a different turn than we would have taken with it. But yes, they got the first part right.
There you go. Well, so let's talk through that. I mean, what does the article actually say? And then we're going to give you guys some color around it.
Yeah. And so the great line, the line that you and I both kind of went, oh my gosh, they're reading our brains, right? And so I'll quote the part of it. It says, and the hope is that those contributions, with the help of financial markets, so this is like when the 401ks were getting sort of launched and getting pushed in, this was sort of the hope, was that it will grow substantially over time. And so this generation of American workers that's now entering retirement age are the products of a 40-year experiment with self-directed retirement financing. And now we get to see whether it worked. And that pisses me off at some level, because I don't want to be an experiment.
Name after the quote?
No, but I just don't want to be an experiment.
It's not about credit. It's about the experiment itself.
That's funny. It's not about whether I got credit for it, but like, I don't want to be a guinea pig. I don't want to be the experiment for whether this is a good idea.
Well, and that's what we've been saying, is that it is an experiment. And it's so nice to hear somebody with maybe a larger footprint or voice saying the same thing, that it is an experiment. Because if we think about what was happening prior to the late 70s, it was pension or nothing. I mean, you're relying on Social Security. And even this idea of retirement is relatively new, like within a generation.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. Well, and we did this article, so if you haven't listened to it, go back and listen to our conversation around Social Security. But life expectancy when Social Security was first started was 60. Mm-hmm. So if you're working till 65 or whatever that age would have,
life expectancy at that point.
Yeah. And so this idea of sort of like strolling into retirement and watching it all go by, and the golden years and all of that stuff, that wasn't a thing. And so this idea of, well, let's give old age pensions and let's give people a safety net and to go through, was like, okay, yeah, that's a great deal. But the environment was different and the population was different and everything was different. But when I talk to people
nobody likes if you start taking money away. And so if, your neighbor who's older than you gets paid out at 65, you don't want to have to wait until 70. So even shifting out, like we make cost of living adjustments, we don't make adjustments for life expectancy.
For sure. Right. Well, because nobody wants to, as one of our friends says, nobody wants to hurry to that whipping. Like nobody wants to hurry that conversation around, hey, we're going to have to cut your pay and
Yeah, if
we're
it's
going to
I'm
have to
going to
make
give
you
you
retire.
more for cost of living, we're all happy to have that conversation. But hey, you
Right.
don't get to get paid till later. None of us want to have that conversation. That's not how
Right.
you get elected into office. Hey, my platform, I'm running on the you don't get paid Social Security platform.
Right. It's a third rail, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
the prototypical third rail of politics. But I think that that sort of begs the question of, and the thing that drives me nuts about talking with clients is, hey, what are you doing for retirement? Like it's sort of the opening question, and what do you got? What's going on? And like bar none, every single person's like, well, I've got a 401k and I'm putting in this much and I get this much in math in my match, and I'm also doing a Roth. And it's like, okay. And but to your point earlier today, in another conversation, we treat that as if it were gravity. Like this is just what happens. This is what you do. Like they don't
Yeah,
ever think, I'm not sure if it's a good idea. It's
because it's just the
everyone
way
does
it
this.
is.
Yeah.
Right. And to give you kind of what Eric is referencing, he and I were having a conversation earlier, and the conversation was around, okay, but if I drop an apple and it falls to the ground, that's just the way it is. So very few people are going to be like, but why does it fall to the ground? Or is there ever a time where it shouldn't fall to the ground? Right. I mean, those are questions that don't really come up in daily life. And I feel like putting money into a 401k is treated the same way. Like you don't
Right.
ask questions, you just do it. This is a
Right.
law, just like gravity is a law. And the reality is it's pretty new. I mean, it's 1978, y'all.
Yeah.
There
I
you
mean,
go.
that
There's my
was,
Texas showing. 1978, y'all.
well, yeah. And then, but then we're the experiment. And that's the part that I don't think people realize is that this is not, it is what we do. It is gravity, quote unquote. But we've not actually tested this all the way through. We've tested gravity 4 million ways from Sunday, but we've not actually tested the 401k as a retirement system. And yet we hold that with the same level of reverence of like, this is what we do.
Mhm.
And one of the things they talked about in the article is because we had that shift away from pensions and we moved it towards, you've got to go do it on your own. You've got to put the money aside. You might get a match because it's they're trying to incentivize you to go do the thing. But one of the things they talked about was that their estimate is that 49% of the population in the ages of 55 to 65 have nothing set aside for retirement.
I believe that.
And that means half of the population have nothing set aside. And that's
So
terrifying.
So this speaks to a question that we do sometimes, Eric, when we do seminars, where we talk about Social Security. And one of the questions that we ask, because we're leading in to other conversation,
Sure.
is if you had the opportunity to stop contributing to Social Security, because who knows if it's going to be there, and you had the ability to take that money and take control of it and save it and do whatever you wanted to do with it to build for your future, how many of you would do that? Show your hand, raise your hand.
Right.
And it's almost always almost everyone,
Right.
because we want the burden hand. We've been taught if you can take it, take it. And the reality is that a lot of people would take that and then go spend it because there's other pressures.
Right. Right. But with the best of intentions. I don't think we all intend to go do that. Maybe, maybe not.
Maybe. I mean, I think it depends, right? I think there are definitely people who would take it and then replicate the system, especially if that was the intent. But I think there are lots of people who might try to replicate the system and then something happens and so they cannibalize it, as opposed to planning for outside influences disrupting what you're doing.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But I think that I don't think the impulse is the wrong impulse. I think it's just that our execution sucks.
As human beings.
Correct. Right. I mean, that's right. There's a famous quote by a guy named General Mattis. He said that the toughest 6 inches of any battlefield is the one between your ears. And
Mhm.
it's the hardest part of the job is it's not math, it's human behavior. It is the challenges that we have for the day to day.
And I think the statistic you just read, which is that half of the population that's within 10 years of retiring has nothing set aside for it.
Right.
I mean, that right there says that at least half of the population is not going to take the shift in capital to do something with it.
Right. So then the article kind of goes into a couple different things, and it talks about sort of how it kind of came about. And I thought the interesting part of the article, and I'm trying to find it in the transcript here, was that shift away from guaranteed income, guaranteed pensions. I work with this company for 47 and a half years since I was a fetus, and I'm retiring, and I get this guaranteed income for the rest of my life. And it was sort of the idea, I think, at the time was that it was the compensation for a life spent at this company. Like you've given us your working years to make cars and raw steel and whatever we're making here at Widgets Land. And in response for that and in appreciation for that, we're going to take care of you on the rest of the other end. But it was onerous. And if you looked at life expectancy, it was a problem.
Well, and it initially, when there were pensions, it wasn't, because the pensions kicked in after life expectancy.
Right.
So again, like, you work until most people would graduate from the planet, and there's some buffer years if you accidentally live too long. But if you think about how that would apply now, it would mean that you work until you're 80 plus years old before you ever would receive your pension in order for that same math to work. But retirement age didn't shift out.
Yep.
But life expectancy did, and life potential did. And so it became more and more onerous as time went on.
Right, but it didn't start out that way. And so I think people were looking, I think the companies at that point were looking for an off-ramp. Like, hey, this is unsustainable. Because I remember growing up, and I remember when I was a kid, and even into my sort of kind of low double digit, mid double digit years, and running into people that were 70, 75, and it was like, man, they're old. Like it was unexpected that you saw somebody that old, and they're like, man, you lived to 80? That's crazy. Wow, you really made it. And now it's like, man, 70, 75, that's not that bad. I mean, you still got a lot of life ahead of you. Right. And so even in my lifetime, to your point about the generations, that idea of going from 65 to 80 is that sounds about right. Like, you can make it to 80, no big deal. That's a huge deal. That's a huge shift in how long people are on the planet. What a wonderful thing. That's amazing, but we haven't adjusted.
And it means that the money has to last for a much longer period of time. And I think this kind of brings together the life expectancy conversation.
Correct.
And the conversation about being the experiment. Is that if you look at some of the studies that have done, there was a study called the Trinity study that was done in the late 1990s by two professors out of Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. And they won a Nobel Prize for the work they did. And what they did was a Monte Carlo simulation. And a Monte Carlo it was the first time they had done that. It was the first time a Monte Carlo simulation had been applied to the stock market. That was the major thing here. And that's basically looking at every possible sequence of return that could have happened given what the market actually did. And so they run all these sequences. Well, the guys who did this won a Nobel Prize, and their conclusion was that you could safely spend between 4 and 6% of your portfolio every single year, and you would have a very high chance of being able to take income for the duration of your lifetime. But the duration of a lifetime in the 90s was different than what it is now in the 20s. And when you even go beyond that, the data they had was relatively limited, because the investments prior to 401ks that were done in the stock market were generally either large institutions or the uber wealthy. And so when you start even looking at, and I think we did a podcast on this way back in the day, is mutual funds and how many families own them. In 1978, less than 2% of the American population owned mutual funds. And today it's what, 60, 65? It's much higher, right? And everybody at least knows what they are. And so even the behavior of the stock market prior to the advent of 401ks was different, because you had people that either had a lot of money, so they weren't as emotionally tied to every dollar in their portfolio, or you had large institutions that could be more objective about what was happening with the money because it wasn't theirs personally. And then you contrast that with what's happening today, which is everything moves faster because of technology, and emotions can wreak havoc on what's happening in the stock market. So it's not necessarily as logical of a place as it used to be. And when you start factoring all of that in, if 401ks show up in 1978, 20 years later, someone is at the cutting edge of this research looking at what's happening. There's not a lot of history for how the market behaves when, as a population, we're full throttle into it.
Right.
And, you know, when you look at the number of people entering into the stock market that are now investing, it's also not shocking that we have kind of seen continuous growth because there's more and more people putting more and more money into the stock market as well.
Well, and whether they understand it or not, or are conscious of it or not, I think everyone has figured out that this is the only place to go put their money. And so talk about the emotional component. Like if I've got, 70, 80% of my income during retirement taken care of by pension and social, the market doesn't have to be an amazing place and I'm still going to be fine.
Mm-hmm.
But if I don't have a pension and I'm starting to get really, really seriously worried about social, every dollar in the market is a very, very powerful and important dollar for my future. And so I think at that point, the emotion goes up dramatically because you have this fear and greed cycle that's coming in of like, hey, if the market's up, man, we got to get all we can get while the getting's good because we need this money to carry us. And if it's falling down, right, because it's everything, it's carrying all the way to the system, all the way to our retirement on this one thing. And so no joke that the market's going to be volatile at that point. Right. And there's an old dumb saying. It's not a dumb saying. It's a really great saying. But a lie makes it halfway around the world before the truth ever gets its shoes on. And and if you think about it, like every time I hear a piece of news, if all I'm worried about is the market, I'm reacting to that piece of news immediately because I'm trying to figure out what's going on before the truth ever gets there about what's really going on. And I might have, because I'm so charged about it, I might make different decisions than if I'm a more sophisticated investor with lots of money.
Right.
And
I
think go ahead.
I think it's important here to say we are not anti 401k.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
I think that's important because I think sometimes when we go on these rants, people might make that jump. That might be their conclusion. What we take issue with, and I think this is the part that maybe needs some clarity, is that if you are just shoving as much money as you can into the stock market, and that is the only thing you're doing, and you're chasing rate of return, and you're hoping for high net worth, you need to understand, and it goes back to one of the opening lines in this podcast, that is still an experiment. We are still figuring out what you can safely spend each year. I mean, that study I mentioned, the Trinity study, said the number was 4 to 6%. You read a lot of things that say 4% even now. If you're looking at life expectancy only, it's probably accurate given the data.
Correct.
But when you start looking at life potential and you take yourself out to 90 years old instead of 80, or you go all the way to 100, if 1 out of every 10 possible market sequences lead to you going broke sometime in the back half of your retirement, that's not safe. I mean, we wouldn't fly on an airline that crashed 1 out of every 10 planes, and yet we're like 90%. Oh, that seems pretty good.
Well, right. But
is it? Right. And so I think this is where our frustration comes in, is that we, as a population, we sort of just accept that this is the way things are done because that's the way it's been done during our working lifetime, and it's what our parents did, so it's what they're telling us to do.
Right.
But that doesn't mean it's the best thing we can do for the situation we find ourselves in.
Well, and the other thing I think is important is the context. If you look at the late 70s, the tax bracket and the tax rates in society at that point were much, much, much higher than they are right now. Now, I
For
think
the
we're
high
probably
earners.
right for the high earners. Now, I think we may be going back to that, but that's a different podcast. But
Okay.
if you look at where we are right now, we're in a relatively low tax environment. And so this idea of sort of deferring money into a 401k to lower our current tax bracket so that we can pay the money later in 78, 80, 81, that made total sense.
Explain why.
Well, so if I make 200 grand, but my tax rate is 50%, because I can do this math, right? Well, I don't want to pay 50% of my income in taxes. That seems horrible. But if I could push money into a tool, into a system, into a product that allowed me to not have to pay that tax, and so let's say I put 50 grand in. So I went from 200 grand to now 150 as far as my income because I deferred or I pushed money into this 401k in order to save money for retirement. Well, I lowered my tax bill pretty dramatically by 25%. I lowered my income by 25%.
Mhm.
And then as I'm working and as I'm growing, then when I get into retirement, the conversation at that point was, well, we'll be on a lower tax bracket, either because the tax rates will be lower, I'll be earning less. And so it makes sense to not pay the money now because it's at such a huge rate and defer it and pay it later when the rate is lower. It made sense historically to go do that.
So when we think about the 401k ending up in the tax code initially, and I think motives are key here. Initially, when companies started doing this, it was a way to provide profit sharing to key executives so that executives could be compensated without having to pay high taxes. So
Correct.
to that end, in 1978, the highest marginal tax bracket was 70%. And it was on every dollar earned above 203, 600 or something like that. I may have missed the back end, but let's call it 204,000. We're going to use round numbers.
Right.
So if you made $100,000 above that 203 break point, that $100,000, like the IRS took 70,000 of that, your take home was only $30,000. So if you had the ability to defer it, and I'm using big numbers here for the sake of impact, right? But if you could defer that 100,000 and put it into the 401k, then the hope, like Eric said, would be that when you retired, that you have less income. It's a lower tax bracket. But here's the thing. I don't want to be in a lower tax bracket when I retire. I'd like to be in at least the same tax bracket, and I'll probably have less deductions. That's the point you make all the time, which is that my kids won't be at home. Maybe my house is paid off. I lose some of the deductions. But if I can keep $100,000 earning for me, even knowing I have to pay taxes in the future, because there's $100,000 in the account, the feeling is very, very different. Right. But we're told it's tax savings, and it's not. It is a deferral. And somebody said, and I found this interesting, you are creating tax liabilities for yourself.
Yes.
When you put money into a 401k for a deferral like that. But here's the thing that I think a lot of people miss. And I think this is why advisors pushed this as hard as they did. And with the spin of here's why it's good for you, is that if you got your $100,000 bonus and you had to pay $70,000 and then you give $30,000 to your advisor, they get to take fees on $30,000. But if you put it into the 401k and you don't have to pay the taxes right away, the advisor gets to take their fees on the whole $100,000. So there's two winners when you do this. And newsflash, you're not one of them. The winners are the CPA, right? Because the CPA says, hey, look how much I saved you in taxes this year. And you're like, woo, I kept $70,000 of my money. And so mentally, you feel really excited about that. And then the second winner is the advisor, who's not going to argue with the CPA, because the CPA just gave them an extra $70,000 to manage that they get to take fees on top of.
Right.
And so they're like, hey, this is amazing. Let's do more of this. And so when you think about what that's done for you as the consumer, you're now paying more in fees, and you have a tax liability at some point in the future, and you have no idea what the tax rates are going to be when you retire. No idea.
Right.
You can hope that they're the same rate as they are right now, but you don't
Well,
have control over that.
well,
you
and that,
an open-ended liability, and you have no idea what that tax liability is going to be.
right. And nor do you get a vote.
I mean, technically you get a vote, but it's not a direct one.
It's not a direct vote, right? And again, we'll stay away from that one. But I mean, you don't get a really hard vote. Yeah, I don't want to pay that tax. You don't get to say, yeah, I don't want to do that. Whatever it is, you get to pay
at a lower rate, please.
Yeah. Can I get a discount on that? And they're like, yeah, that's not how that works. But it goes to another point that we make quite a bit, and I think it's fascinating watching it sort of play out over time. Is in my decision cycle, or in so many people's decision cycle, one of the first or second things they're factoring into the decision is a tax question, not a wealth creation question,
right,
or an income question, or a cash flow question. It's what can I do right now so I can avoid tax, pay a different tax on that other end of it. And I think at the other component, it's not that taxes aren't important, but I think it's a further down the line question that we should be asking, not the first question. Because I find so often that we do a bunch of really kind of dumb things when I'm looking at what's going to build wealth for me, what's going to build distribution. When I think about that question first, than if I was asking a tax question first.
Yeah, you're making different decisions.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean that the taxes aren't important. Like I want to pay exactly the right amount that then I have to pay not a penny more. But if I make a lot more money because I made a different decision, then I don't really care as much about the tax.
Well, and let's do an example of that. So let's say we're in a 40% tax bracket, right? And you save 10% in taxes on your income that year, and you feel really, really good about it.
Right.
But had you made a different decision, you could have increased your income by 30% in retirement every year of retirement.
Right.
Which one is more important to you? Saving 10% once this year, or would you pay that 10% now to have a 30% increase on your income every year during retirement? Because I know which decision I would make. I would be happy to pay more in taxes today to make sure I had all that extra income in the future, especially if you bake in tax efficiencies to that future income that protect me from a potentially rising rate.
Right. But I think we don't do that because it's 2 or 3 steps in that decision.
Right. It's complex. Well, and if I'm thinking about the 401k, I can just look and be like, oh, I didn't pay 10 grand in taxes this year. That feels good. But what I may not realize is that in the future, I have to pay a lot more in taxes.
Correct.
Not just because of rate, but because if my money actually really grows and I do get to maintain my income or have more income, which by the way, can we just deal with that? Like, why would we go into a financial advisor's office and be like, make sure I have less money when I retire? Why do we do that? Why is that the normal? Well, I'll be in a lower tax bracket. Like, I get that you're saying that, but why is that what you're planning for? Because it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're like, make sure, hey, sir, make sure I'm in a lower tax bracket when I retire.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Well, and
make sure I'm in the highest tax bracket that you could possibly get me into, given my resources. No one says that. But I'm gonna tell you, that's what I want. You give me all the money.
Right.
Even if it's not money for the sake of money. I mean, again, more income means you can go bless more lives, do more things.
Right. Yeah. You could retire later. You could retire earlier. You have choice. And I think that's, and the article covers this a little bit, and I think they kind of take a weird turn with it, but it goes back to the point that you made at the very beginning, is that if we ask the question in a room, who would stop paying Social Security if they could get that money back? And everyone raises their hand and says yes. Right. And I think it's in our DNA and it's in our sort of culture that we want control and we want choice and we want to have the ability to sort of map out our future. Mm-hmm. The challenge that I have sometimes is we want that control, but then we stop. Now I have all the control. And I would choose, and I'm choosing to make really bad choices. So let's drive this car into a ditch because someone gave me the wheel and a gas pedal and a stick shift, and I'm going to drive the car into the ditch. But look what I did. I made that happen. And
I'm
so
driving a really cool car.
but I have a really
It's
cool car. See the one in the ditch over there that's upside down? That's mine. But I think we miss the education component of I want all the choices, I want the control, I want the freedom. Yes, all the time, yes. But it comes with responsibility.
right. Is it a Spider-Man
Spider-Man,
quote?
yeah.
Yeah, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think that personal responsibility is key. So this actually was interesting because as part of the tone of the article, the question was, is retirement a right or a privilege? And is
Right.
the responsibility for retirement placed at a higher either governmental or societal level versus
Right.
an individual level?
Right.
And I think this probably people's opinions will vary wildly upon, but the system that we have right now places the responsibility on the individual, whether you like it or not, right?
Right.
That means is we cannot abdicate our responsibility for building our future to anyone, right?
Right.
Not me, not you, not, Joe Schmo podcaster,
Warren Buffett, whatever.
not TikTok, none of those people. It is a personal responsibility in an individualized system right now. And
Right.
Social Security can act as a safety net, but for a lot of people, it isn't going to come anywhere near lifestyle replacement. And
Right.
so that personal responsibility cannot be taken lightly. And, if you're one of those people that's like, I'm not really interested in this, then you probably aren't listening to our podcast. So to some degree, we're preaching to the
Preach to the
choir
choir.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that element of personal responsibility is key. And you can't just say, well, this is what everyone else is saying or doing, so this is what I should do, because that's kind of why we're in this particular situation. And maybe it made sense for our parents to defer their compensation because they avoided paying at 70%. But if the highest marginal bracket today is 37%, and we look at historically the highest marginal bracket average, it's about 57%. So we're in a very low tax rate environment for the wealthy, even though I would argue that most people who are in that bracket are like, oh, I'm paying so much in taxes, as opposed to recognizing you have this moment to lock in a low rate and
Right.
then make sure that you can grow your wealth efficiently moving forward. And I think there's an element there that personal responsibility is key. And I'm going to go to the second piece of this, which is it a right or is it a privilege? The way the system is set up right now, regardless of opinion, it is a privilege.
For sure. Right.
Because if you don't take personal responsibility for planning for your future, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit. Or
Well,
you
and
may
that was
fit, but you still get what you get.
right. Yeah. I can rage against a wall, but the wall doesn't move, right?
Right.
So, and that was kind of the end of it. And what I found interesting is as they kind of closed the podcast out, they didn't quite capture they missed the whole point. They gave us a lot of data.
What do I do now?
Yeah, there was no what do I do now, but here was the last one of the last lines in the podcast. And so long as we live in a world where it's considered a privilege, to your point, right? It's going to put a lot of the onus on workers themselves. And that's a very hard problem to solve with policy measures and perks, meaning we can give you all the perks we want and you're still not going to solve this problem correctly. It ultimately comes down to whether individuals have access to retirement plans and if they have the money, enough money and enough discipline to contribute on a regular basis. All of that is 100% true. The thing they miss, though, is they're still looking at retirement through the lens of net worth. I need a retirement plan. I need to contribute more. I need to have more discipline. All of those things may be true.
Save more, live on less today. That's it.
Correct. But that's a very low resolution way to go plan because it's still, I go back to the 3% rule. For every $1 million I have in my bank, I only get to spend 3%, 30K. I don't know any families right now making 30K that could have saved $1 million by the time they get to retirement. I don't know many families earning 60 that could save 2 million, so on and so forth. This is not a rich people, poor people problem. And it's not also, I should be saving more, but it's not also, am I saving enough? It's, am I designing a system that's designed to give me maximum income and that's pointing to income replacement? Or am I just trying to build a big pot? And there's no
Right.
correlation. And that's the problem.
So here's what I want to leave you guys with today. This is an easily solvable problem.
Yes. Which is maddening.
When you focus on distribution strategy, you have to balance rate of return and growth, your accumulation plan, with your safe spending rate and your distribution plan. If all you ever focus on is chasing return, you are leaving out half of the equation, and that half of the equation is just as important. That distribution, I mean, if you can double or more your safe distribution rate without risk of running out of money, just that alleviates so much pressure on what you're doing. And that is what we teach. So keep listening to the podcast. If you're listening for the first time, go back and listen to the past episodes to get caught up and up to speed. These are the important things, is changing that distribution strategy so that you don't have to work harder, you don't have to take more risk, and you don't have to sacrifice everything you love about your life just to make sure you're not broke in the future.
And if you need a podcast recommendation for which episode to go listen to, I'm going to recommend episode 113 because it lays out all of these challenges in the history of a lot of this and how that solution got put in place to go focus on income. Great. It's one of my saved. I listen to it every couple of years or every couple of months just to kind of refresh some of the greatness of that actual episode and the interview we did during that episode. But if you had to just listen to one, or if you've never listened before, that's a great one to go to.
Awesome. Well, Eric, if they have questions for you, where can they find you?
I'm at Economics with Eric, wherever you use social media. And how about you?
At The Wealth Woman. If you're looking for me, shoot me a DM.
See you guys.
Specific financial concepts and advanced strategies are presented to you for educational purposes only. We cannot and do not guarantee their applicability to your individual circumstance. We encourage you to seek personalized advice from qualified professionals on all financial matters.
Provided content is for overview and is not intended and should not be relied upon as individualized tax, legal, fiduciary, or investment advice. Neither Wealth Woman, Acorn Grove, or the Wealth and Income Podcast, nor their representatives provide tax or legal advice. For answers to specific questions and before making any decision, please consult a qualified attorney or tax advisors.
All numeric examples and any individual shown are hypothetical and were used for explanatory purposes only. Actual results may vary.
Investing involves risk, which includes potential loss of principal. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. Guarantees are subject to the claims paying ability of the issuing insurance company.
Life insurance should be purchased by individuals that have a need to provide a death benefit to protect others with insurable interests in their lives against financial loss. Life insurance is not a retirement plan, investment, or savings account.
Not affiliated with or endorsed by the Social Security Administration, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or any governmental agency. Insurance and investment products, not a deposit, not FDIC or NCUA insured, not insured by any federal government agency, not guaranteed by any bank or credit union, may lose value.
Please visit the Wealth Woman website disclosure page for other important disclosures.